Good afternoon to all of you, and I take pleasure to welcome you all to this very important special session. Before that, I wish to really underline the activity of the CIIPC Center's activity in terms of organizing this Asia Pacific workshop on innovation, IP and competition. I'm highly satisfied noting that this workshop has undertaken a wide range of debates during all these 5 days. Though I have not been to these sessions, but I have shared this feedback from my colleagues and friends who have been attending this program. And it is interesting to note that so many interfaces have been covered as far as this workshop is concerned, which include the interface of innovation, intellectual property and competition with a special focus on automobile sector, online platforms, pharmaceuticals, creative industries, information and communication technology, and agriculture and biotechnology sector. Let me take this opportunity to thank all eminent speakers and participants who have been to this workshop. And I'm sure that these sessions have been highly useful and they have evoked enough attention and debates. And I'm sure the center would be taking care of pursuing them in their research pursuits in the times to come. Here I have a pleasant duty on behalf of the National Law University Delhi to particularly welcome Professor Drexl to this university, and thank you sir for having you. We are very happy to host you, and today, as Arul has shared, that he's going to speak on sense of shame as a virtue, and as it's been mentioned that this is one area where he has been working for quite some time. A little introduction, though, as we all know that he's a very well-known authority in this particular field, but those who are meeting him first time, he's a director of Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich since 2002, and an honorary professor at the University of Munich and a member of Bavarian Academy of Science. As the chair of the project managing board of Munich Intellectual Property Law Center Cooperation Project, Professor Drexl is responsible for an LLM program in IP with international outreach. He was the founding chair of the Academic Society for Competition Law from 2003 to 2013, and he is the vice president of the Association of International Droit Economics. He acted as a visiting professor at the Oxford University, at LUISS, and he has so many other highlights to be mentioned here. And he is an expert in both competitive law, competition law, and intellectual property law. The competition law aspects of IP and international issues of both IP and competition law are among his major research interests. More recent works of Professor Drexl focuses on the IP and competition law issues of the new digital economy in times of industry 4.0 and the Internet of Things. In times when our political opinions are shaped by appeals to emotion and perpetuated bias, understanding the economy of attention markets becomes crucial for legal scholars, practitioners, and students alike. It is extremely important to understand social platform as a market for ideas, especially due to the insidious ways in which they influence our minds. I suppose that this subject is going to be very, very important one. In India, in fact, a lot of discussion is going on this particular issue, especially the attention market and role of various social platform. I'm aware that we used to discuss. You have mentioned social psychology in your, presentation. I'm also aware that one point of time we used to discuss the attention deficit. Now, this attention deficit is really reversing to become, attention market where attention seekers are out to, to attend what is happening and to finally route through a kind of market-oriented approach for various purposes. So this is going to be a very interesting, discussion that Professor is going to undertake. So with these words, I would now like to invite Professor Drexl to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
I prefer to be here. I'm always happy to stand in front of my audience. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Attention deficit. How do you realize that you have to deal with an attention deficit in your audience? What usually happens nowadays, people would look at their smartphones and go to the Facebook site, and then you get an attention market. So the attention market quite often is an expression of an attention deficit. Thank you also for introducing the topic. I'm often asked, how did you end up with that topic? And maybe I should tell you up front a little bit more about this, because then you also understand what I'm doing in general. Because this is really a topic that connects with many of my even very old ideas, how I thought about competition law. Without competition law, I would not be interested in that topic, and that is already a surprise. And it also connects a lot with copyright law, which might be even a bigger surprise. Why? I start maybe with a project we did a couple of years ago for WIPO. I was approached by WIPO, and I was asked to do a study on the interface of competition law and copyright law. WIPO had decided to make competition law an additional focus of its work, which mostly came from the development agenda. And then it was thought maybe competition law is an important field, especially for developing and emerging economies, and they wanted me to do an international study, comparative study of how competition law is applied in a copyright environment. And I said, but please allow me to do like I want it to be. And I told them, I don't only want to write about and look at refusal to license. This is a much too narrow approach. What is much more important in the copyright field is to see how works actually reach consumers and what are the impediments when it comes to linking authors with consumers. And then this was suddenly a wonderful study, because when we looked at the different jurisdictions, we found so much experience. It mostly related to bottleneck industries like cable networks, like satellite networks when it comes to TV programs, also networks, even software that controls the distribution of news. So suddenly the study, to a large part, produced a lot of insight on media markets. Later on, I wrote an article in World Competition Law, because I especially found that nexus between the media or copyright, news, and competition law a fascinating topic, because I also discovered even in some developing countries or emerging countries, I found very recent cases that had very strong political implications. And in that context, also the issue showed up whether democracy can be a value that we can take into account in the application of competition law. And then, that was about 2 years ago, I was asked to be a speaker on a panel in honor of Eleanor Fox. Maybe you know her, maybe one of the most prestigious competition law scholars we have worldwide from NYU. She has a particular record in criticizing Chicago School, arguing against this focus on economic efficiency. And in particular, she always said Chicago has a political agenda. And I was asked to be a speaker on a panel which was entitled Competition Law and Ideology. And then I asked myself, but what will be my topic? And I told myself, no, I don't want to talk about the history of Chicago School. There has to be something new. And at that time, and please, that was about 2 years ago, when nobody knew about Brexit, when nobody would believe that the US would vote for Trump. I had just read a newspaper article in Süddeutsche Zeitung about a study that was very much at the end of the newspaper, on the last pages, on new research or something by Italian computer scientists who did a study on the distribution of news. And it was basically on Facebook and social platforms, and it was basically about how the mechanism of Facebook and other social platforms promotes conspiracy theories. And I got very interested. And I said, oh, wonderful. Economic incentives and you get bad politics. Or you promote ideas, and that's going against all ideas of Chicago School. Because Chicago School has the idea that if everybody takes into account self-interest, economic self-interest, then markets will work best, and if you take everything together, this will promote social welfare, period. And that's the end of the analysis. That's basically Chicago School, to put it very roughly. And I have the impression that's not the case in this particular situation. And maybe there's something to it when it comes to a typical competition law analysis. And this is when I started it. I presented this in June 2016, so 2 years ago. It was just before the Brexit vote, and my colleagues came up, "You are completely crazy. What are you telling us here? This is a conspiracy theory, and I'm also on Facebook, and you can't blame me for being so stupid." And I said, that's not what I'm telling you. And only a few days later, the Brexit vote took place, and then Trump took place, and I put my article, which then got revised, and it had this title of Post-Truth Politics on SSRN. And ever since, I'm among the 10 most downloaded academics on SSRN. Ever since. It's my second most popular article I have on SSRN. Things have developed enormously. Now Germany also has a law against it. And even in my research, I would not have expected it. I'm also a member of the Bavarian Academy of Science, and I'm now leading a research group, an international, interdisciplinary research group, and we basically want to do research on what we call facticity. What are facts? That's not so easy. It's enormously complicated. And also we want to look at, because there is also criticism on the sciences. And the sciences have to ask themselves, why is there criticism? Is the criticism justified? And how do we win back the discussion? Because by fake news, also the sciences are put here on the bench of the accused, right? So we need to act also in common with the different sciences. And it's very, very difficult, because also in the sciences, we often discover we were wrong. And frankly speaking, there is a lot of fake news coming from the sciences, including legal fake news. And ever since I have been working on that topic, I've become more self-critical. I often ask myself, how do I think? Why do I act this way? I become very critical. And I think I would also want to transmit a little bit of that insight to you. Because may I ask you a question? How many of you, please raise your hands, have never heard about filter bubbles and echo chambers? Anybody? You have never heard? No? I really have to explain it? All the newspapers are full. Maybe not here in India? I don't know. Okay, so it takes a little bit longer. Wonderful. I will start now. That was just a side note in a way. Do you know this gentleman? Anybody? Please raise your hands. Does anybody know this gentleman? Well, in the United States, I think he's quite prominent already. Go to Google and Google his name. You will find very wonderful citations. Still a young, splendid young man, but he has quite a history. Justin Rosenstein. He is the guy who developed the like button for Facebook. 10 years ago, at the age of 24, he earned a lot of money, got a lot of money when he left Facebook, and now see what he's saying nowadays and what he's doing. In 2017, at the age of 34, he bought a new smartphone, and he decided to use a parental control system to prevent himself from using social platforms. And then take this citation. When I walk around and see people staring at their phones, often it's because they've taken their phones to look at Facebook notifications. And then he says, that's something I feel is not going in the right direction for society. He has become quite a critical person on his own past. And that is what I mean by filter bubbles and echo chambers. And that was actually also the message of this study of Italian computer scientists. They had discovered that those conspiracy theories, they also had a definition of what a conspiracy theory is. It's basically something for which you cannot prove the opposite. Just to give you an example, a conspiracy theory, for example, would be that vaccination causes epilepsy. There is no evidence that this is true, but you simply maintain that's true, but how can you prove the opposite, that this is not true? Yeah? It's practically impossible. But somebody comes with the statement, and then you should prove the opposite. And those conspiracy theories, they checked how it was distributed on the internet, how persistent this was, and they came up with quite interesting results. And they also tried to identify the problem, and this is usually what we mean by filter bubbles. It means that basically if you enter and you rely mostly on news from Facebook or other social platforms, and you don't get information maybe from the newspapers or TV channels, and please note there are also newspapers who are create kind of filter bubbles, and also TV stations and news stations who create some kind of filter bubbles, where you end up by only communicating with people who have the same opinion. And in the echo chambers, it basically means you express your opinion and you are always reconfirmed because people share your opinion. And this gets stronger and stronger. There is also, there are wonderful psychological tests done by sample groups. For example, there were psychologists who had a group of people with very, very different opinion, right-wing, left-wing, or liberal, conservative, depending on where you come from. And they asked them to discuss for 1 hour the issue of abortion. And they did it with twice with different people. The first time they put everybody together, and then after 1 hour they asked about the opinion. Their opinion was very mitigated. And then they separated another sample group in conservatives and liberals. At the end, they were all radicalized. So it's not necessarily something that we see on social platforms. It's something that simply happens. If you are among a group with very, very identical opinions, then you may face that particular situation. And I think on the right-hand side, that's very intuitive. Breaking news on Facebook, 11 facts that support all your opinions. That's basically what it means. That's very straightforward. There have been also studies then, later on, in the United States, for example, on Washington Post. They researched this as well, and they tested what kind of information you get on Facebook, depending on whether you are more conservative and liberal, concerning reports, news reports on the election campaign. And it was completely different worldviews, right? If you're a supporter of Trump, it all goes in the direction of Trump and the other way around. It's much more complex. You will see. There's a lot of complexity to the topic. When I often refer to Facebook, I need to apologize. I use Facebook more as one example of a social platform. And so please, I don't want to act specifically against Facebook, but Facebook is the most important social platform in this regard. And it has also become a major target of enforcers. If you ask Facebook, which country is the country where you have most problems, I guess they would immediately tell you it's Germany. And you will hear why. I will tell you a little bit more. So what we now have is, and this is why I'm so surprised, it's definitely an issue that we have all around the world. And this is also argued one of the reasons why we have populist movements all around the world, because Facebook is now used everywhere. I would be very cautious when it comes to the question whether Facebook can be held responsible for Brexit, for the Brexit vote, as it turned out, and for the Trump elections. We don't know to which extent it contributed. It's very difficult to measure. What we know, and I followed this very carefully, the day after the Trump vote, there were all the studies done by the computer scientists. The presidential elections in the United States are always elections that are scrutinized by many, many researchers. And it's now basically about the computer scientists. And we have a lot of information how internet influenced maybe public opinion. We know it influenced it, but we don't know the degree, and we don't know whether this really was the reason why Trump won and why Brexit turned out like it turned out. But please take into account, if you follow this, if you take this may also explain another feature. We are all in filter bubbles and echo chambers. This may also explain, if you talk to the British, many people after the vote said, I would never have believed that Britain would vote for Brexit, and because of this, I didn't go to vote. Simply because I have never met anybody who said I would vote for Brexit. Simply because we are all in our communities. Or how many people do you know who voted for Trump? Especially, I don't know, maybe this is a filter bubble here. Right? We are in an academic society which has a certain trend, might be maybe more liberal. There are certainly other quarters of academia. So there's a lot of discussion. But what is missing is exactly what I was most interested in. Namely the connection between the political effects there are or might be, or the challenges there are, or the dangers, I would rather say there are dangers for the political process, and we don't want democracy to be endangered. That has always been a topic for media regulation, private TV, name it, in many, many jurisdictions. And this is a new world of media or news provision. And many, many media regulators, also in Germany, they have thought about those issues even before. But they looked at Facebook and other social platforms very positively, because Facebook seems to be completely neutral. We are not engaging in any censorship on any opinion. So it seemed to be very, very neutral. Quite on the contrary. Before that debate, Facebook was considered to be also a platform for opponents in countries that had very little possibility to engage and develop opposition movements, like the Arab Spring. Facebook was enormously important for making it possible for young people to express themselves. So I think that needs to be said as well. So there is a big ambivalence when it comes to the effects of Facebook on public opinion and politics. It has positive as well as maybe negative effects. What I'm interested in is the following equation, because it contains two aspects that are highly neglected in the public debate. The first one is the economic rationale underlying the business model of social platforms, and and that is the crucial interaction, human psychology. We need to approach the topic from an interdisciplinary perspective. And this creates a problem which blows up our mind, if you would like to put it that way, or which creates maybe a problem for democracy. And I would like to get a better understanding, or to provide a better understanding what is actually going on here, by also looking more carefully at modern economics for these markets. And here we talk about attention markets. I don't know whether you have already heard about that term, which is typically used for social platforms, and the particular psychology of humans that interacts with this particular economy. And actually the business model of Facebook, not least the like button, makes use of this, as you will see. And this has to be the basis when we think about future regulation. This is what I mean by the market situation. That is probably very familiar for you, especially for those of you who do competition though. Facebook is active in a two-sided market. Facebook is financed by advertising. And for advertising customers, Facebook becomes so interesting because it attracts many, many users. The more users you have, or put it that way, the more attention you get from users, the higher the advertising value of Facebook. So what Facebook actually has to achieve, and it achieves it very, very well, is to make people spend as much time as possible on Facebook. Yeah? So that is the logic behind the whole system. And you have all heard about the economics of multi-sided or two-sided markets. And on top of this, there's maybe a more modern variation of that school, which can be called the economics of attention markets. And the attention here in this context basically means that the highest or the most important factor here is the attention of users paid to Facebook. Yeah, and attention is looked here as an economic asset. You will see what this actually means in a minute. So if you look more closely at the literature that is relevant here, you probably know quite well about the economics of multi-sided markets. It goes back to very important articles written by the two French economists, Jean-Charles Rocher, who died a couple of years ago, and Jean Tirole. Jean Tirole got the Nobel Prize for this kind of research. And this research highlights the indirect network effects between the two sides of the market. So the more users you get, the more advertising customers you attract, the more money you get in, and then at the same time, the more money you get in, the more you can invest in the quality of your service, right? So both sides basically benefit. And the larger the market is on one side, the more people you will attract from the other side. This is also a theory for arguing why such platforms tend to be rather big, right? The more you attract, the more attractive the website or this platform will actually become. You can apply the same to Google. So if you want to analyze the search engine of Google from a competition law perspective, you necessarily end up with this particular feature. And what is also explained by this is that this also explains the pricing mechanism. And here, especially when it comes to the attention market side, users don't need to pay. It's only the advertising customer that pays. And the reason is, this is the most efficient way of doing it. So economists would not criticize this, right? If another form of financing, making users pay, would be more efficient, then Facebook would do this. So we should not intervene in the pricing structure. That's basically the argument. But what modern economics would also argue, we should nevertheless recognize the attention market as a proper market. It can be an object of competition law analysis. The economics of attention markets add something, namely in the sense that they explain that different social platforms compete for attention as a scarce product. The time of people is limited, right? So even if we have multi-homing, which is often said, we know that time is a scarce product, and Facebook still wants to have people as long as possible on Facebook's website. And here, attention is also defined as a high economic value. If you read the article by Evans, he calculates the value of attention by simply taking the minimum wage level as the indicator. So what would you earn on a minimum wage level in the United States for every hour you spend on Facebook, and then you multiply, and then this is an enormous prosperous market. It makes Facebook a very important firm, right? So that's the idea behind it, and the conclusion is this is efficient, don't intervene. So from a purely economic perspective, based on consumer welfare, as we understand it, also in the tradition maybe of Chicago School, that's fine, in principle. We are not yet there that we would talk about competition law problems or the typical ones. That is not actually not even my topic. But now let's have a closer look at how the distribution of news works on Facebook. I guess most of you are familiar with Facebook. Most of you will be on Facebook. So maybe I don't have to explain too much, but you don't know about the scale or the importance of the different acts that are explained here. And maybe you don't know all different facets. What happens is basically you can look at the process as a three-stage process. The first stage is that somebody puts something on the internet. This can also be a sub-site or a personal site on Facebook, but it doesn't have to be. And then another Facebook user puts the like button. And this is now transmitted to Facebook, and this also needs to be transmitted to other Facebook users. But the like button is set so often that it is impossible to basically communicate all those like buttons or all those likes to all others of users of Facebook. It's impossible. And at the same time, in addition to the selection, which posts actually will be transmitted, you have to make a decision to whom. And you have to list it. So you have to prioritize. No other way. It's not so different from the indexing with the search function of Google. A similar phenomenon. You need to index. And this is what the algorithm is doing. Until 2013, the so-called edge rank, which was the algorithm at that time, only had three criteria, according to which the selection took place. The first one was affinity. So how close are the persons or the people, the person who liked something and the person who would get the information on the news feed. The second one is weight. You also have an idea in what maybe the recipient is interested. If the recipient is more interested in politics, you get maybe more political views. If you are more interested, if the person is more interested maybe in music, you get information on music. If you are more interested in football, you get more information on football. So to also profile users is very, very important. And the other one is time decay. So how relevant is it from a time perspective? New posts might rank higher than others. But that was very stable. As of 2013, Facebook moved to artificial intelligence. And the information, Facebook is not transparent at all about it, but the information that is available, the assumption is that now the criteria have went up to almost 100,000. Nobody knows, and maybe even Facebook doesn't know. The idea is Facebook is simply checking how much time do people spend on Facebook sites, and according to this, they are trying to experiment and make the time spent on Facebook longer and longer and longer. I heard that the game industry is doing exactly the same. Actually, the industry is trying to make you an addict. That is the mechanism and the economic rationale behind it. Maybe here even there's a problem. Maybe the problem at which Rosenstein hinted when he mentioned all the people sitting around with their smartphones, and he says something is going wrong here. Right? That is a sign of addiction. There is a study by Facebook computer scientists who actually tried to find out how important the 3 steps are when it comes to this effect of filter bubbles and echo chambers. And that is very interesting. The study included 10 million US Americans. And those 10 million US Americans were asked to categorize themselves as liberal or conservative in 2 groups. And then their behavior on Facebook was checked in correspondence to news which were as well categorized according to more liberal and more conservative. And then the percentage of the news was more or less the same at the beginning, at the first stage. So what do you find actually on the internet? What kind of news do we have? And then the first like is set. And here you can already expect those who are more conservative like more the conservative news and the other way around. So you already expect that here you get a first trend into this particular situation. Then comes the algorithm in selecting it. And you would expect, yes, it goes even further in this direction. But then there is the last step. Once you have the news in your news feed, you also have to click and read it. And you see what topic it is and so on. And they did this with the 2 sample groups. And the results were quite striking. Would you guess which part of the 3 steps, namely the like button, the algorithm, and then the reading is most important? People usually think it's the algorithm, and we should regulate the algorithm. No, it's the first one. It's the like button. So actually that also explains why I took Rosenstein, the developer of the like button. So it's not the algorithm. It's also important, it drives the whole mechanism more in this direction, but it's the like button. There's another quite interesting result. The effect is much stronger with the liberals. I have to disappoint you. According to this study, we are much more in a filter bubble than the conservatives. The difference is not that big, but quite marked. So just to wake you up, dear friends. Yeah? So we all have our biases. Now I would like to express a criticism on this very narrow analytical approach of economic efficiency. I think this approach is much too narrow for the problem that we have to deal here when it comes to the distribution of news. Why? The economic analysis doesn't distinguish between different forms of content. There is commercial content, and with commercial content, the restrictive analysis, fine. When it's about sale of products, fine. It's more problematic when it's about the sale of news or the distribution of news, political advertising. Right? Because in this field, of course, we might have also an impact on elections and so on. And the reason why this is so important is also when it's about the sale of goods, everybody can make an individual choice and you get what you prefer. In political terms, no. The winner takes it all. If the majority votes for Trump, you get Trump. Yeah? So this makes, often you have an equation of democracy and the free market. No, there is a difference, and it's the winner takes it all problem, right? So we need to be very careful, and I think that's also a reason why we need to regulate many media markets from a political perspective. Another aspect is that, an economic aspect, that we do not only have the indirect network effects between the two sides of the markets, there are also direct network effects. And when it comes to the distribution of news, as we see, the most important part is the communication among friends. The more friends you have, the more likely you are that you end up and that you will not leave Facebook, right? You connect, you're not interested in the advertising so much. You want to be connected with your friends, and that's the reason why you are there, right? So from that perspective, I think also this attention market theory is nice to explain how the financing goes, but also with regard to market dominance and also with regard to politics, I think the direct network effects are much more important. And we have to look at the Facebook as a market for ideas, or as a mechanism for distributing ideas. And then I think additional issues show up. We as users on Facebook, we are not only consuming news as on TV and as readers of newspapers, we are also producing news because people express their opinion and they create opinion. So we are constantly, people on Facebook are constantly, on social platforms are constantly making news. Trump is constantly making news. The most important news every morning during the election campaign was a report on all TV channels on the latest message Trump put on Twitter, right? And everybody can do it. And many support groups and fake support groups posted opinion in favor of Trump. By the way, also there were also fake support groups in favor of Hillary Clinton. That's got also researched. So maybe more for Trump. There was even a whole city in Macedonia with young people who earned a lot of money in running a website in favor of Trump. Yeah, it's got all researched. Maybe you have heard about this. So we are prosumers of news. We are producing news and we are consuming news. Facebook is controlling the selection criteria. That's very clear. So the algorithm is playing a big role. But also to employ the like button, we should not forget about this particular feature, was a decision by Facebook. The criteria for selecting the news. This is very much based on the theory of attention markets. That's the economic rationale, right? If you want to understand why Facebook is doing this, you need to understand those economics of the attention market. And we need to take into account the public interest. And this is actually the argument with the winner takes it all. And here, this is why I see a conflict between the very nice idea of Adam Smith and the invisible hand, markets work, and democracy. It doesn't. We've got a problem. So, and then came another problem with which I struggled a lot. And it took me quite a lot of thinking and time to deal with this issue. Because there is the assumption in conventional neoliberal economics that we always act rationally. We know that this is no longer the state of the art in economics. There is now the concept of bounded rationality, there is behavioral economics. We should take into account that people do not necessarily assess their interests appropriately. Fine. And then the big question was, is this a case of bounded rationality? Intuitively, we will probably say yes. Because if we have a conflict between social welfare or individual interest and social welfare, social welfare is not achieved by the working of the market, maybe there is a problem of bounded rationality. My conclusion is there is no problem with bounded rationality. We actually act rationally. And here I come up with 3 additional types of economics which we should also discuss and in which economists should go. What is the economics of friends? I give you an example. Sometimes personal experience helps. Just before Christmas 2016, I had to work late in my office. I did not catch the last subway, and I had to take a taxi. I got on the taxi just before Christmas, and immediately the taxi driver started to talk to me. He said, "Oh, really late? So you're just coming home from a Christmas party?" I said, "No." "Okay. So maybe you work in a restaurant?" I said, "No." "So what do you work?" I said, "I'm a researcher." "Oh, that's interesting. What kind of research?" And I said, "I'm a lawyer. I'm a legal scholar." And then he said, "Oh, that's enormously interesting. There are very interesting questions. Does the German Reich still exist?" We have a movement in Germany which is called Reichsbürger. And those people, it's a relatively small group, maintains that they are not citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany, they are still citizens of the German Reich. They would not recognize the authority of German courts, they would not pay taxes, they constantly create problems. And just before this has happened, one of those guys living in northern parts of Bavaria, who was a hunter and had some weapons at home, was identified as one of those Reichsbürger, or citizens of the Reich. They even print their own passports, believe it, and he would not give back the weapons. So the authorities thought, maybe we need to do something about this guy, maybe he might get violent. And so they sent the police to take the weapons, because he would not deliver them voluntarily. And when the police showed up, this guy shot through the door and killed a policeman. And that created a big media coverage on that movement. And this has happened maybe 3 or 4 weeks later. Believe it, after 18 hours in your office, and you have to deal with the Reichsbürger as your taxi driver. And he made comments like, "I know, not everything I read on the internet is true. But there are experts who argue that the Reich still exists. And in addition, that killed me, these are law professors." At that moment, I wanted to get out of the taxi, as you will understand. But when I arrived home, I asked myself, my emotions, are they rational or not? And I finally concluded, if I want to get out of the taxi, it's my damn right. I can't stand that person, right? I don't want to interact with this guy. And that is rational. Live up to it. And it's not for me to educate that guy. I would not be able to do this. And here you see a problem, because personal interest, meeting your friends, discussing issues with your friends, that's natural, and you should not blame for it. There's nothing irrational about it. Like you prefer certain goods, you can prefer your friends. You decide on your friends. And here, in order to communicate with the other group, we now have split societies. I told myself that would be a real burden, maybe a civil obligation. I should have done it, right? But I hated it, and that's rational. And I think that's the first point. Economics of emotions. How do positive feelings relate with economics? Because we end up in the filter bubbles because we like to communicate with those people. How does this relate with economics? And even more, look at the Brexit example. There were so many lies. By now, even UKIP people admit that Brexit will decrease welfare, economic welfare in the UK. There is a recent opinion poll, I read it in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, according to which all people who voted for Brexit will still vote for Brexit. And the UKIP people argue, well, we know welfare will be decreased, but we value Brexit more. We take the negative economic effect into account. There is another problem to this. Because if you constantly deny reality with fake news, and you do this even in an economic environment, by then arguing protectionist tendencies, economics, this may also harm economics. So if we don't take reality into account, economic decisions go in the wrong direction. This decreases welfare. That's very obvious. Like in the Brexit case, or what Trump is doing now with maybe tariffs and whatever, and the kind of politics he is now doing, or by getting out of TPP, yeah, which was actually pushed by the US-American government in the interest of the United States. That's very weird. So this also decreases economics, and that is hard to adjust. So you see that there is much more to it. So that's the economic part. What about the psychological part? When people use Facebook as a source of news for making decisions, we have to take into account what social psychology tells us about human behavior in order to better understand what is actually going on. And there's a lot to be learned from social psychology. And social psychology focuses in particular on the difficulty of humans, we as citizens, in understanding political issues. There are so many of them, and we are not experts. So we have to make political decisions where there is a lot of uncertainty. And the less educated are, the more uncertainty there is, right? For us, maybe we still understand many issues, but there is none in the room who would understand all decisions that are debated or all issues that are debated in an election campaign, right? To a certain extent, we need shortcuts. And there are certain particular features how this works. And now, this is not what I take from Trump. That is social psychology. There are three features that are typically mentioned. First, people tend to prefer emotional language. If you use words like big, great, it's much easier to attract support as if you want to explain difficult problems. It's much easier to convince people. They react positively. So it's much easier to ask, how do you feel about it, than what do you think about it? Because then you reach actually the limits of your understanding. Reliance on information at hand. I give you a wonderful example. Inauguration of Trump, big debate, how many people attended the inauguration. Trump says, millions. I was there, I saw them. Personal experience. Right? There is, I also heard about studies, there's a nice study of a team of two researchers, sociologists, one German, one from Israel, and they made a study, empirical study of people who are against immigration. Both countries are countries with strong immigration. And they asked those people, how many immigrants do we have in your country? For people who are against immigration. It goes by far, far beyond the realistic numbers. So they increase, they see foreigners and they think, now we have 80% of foreigners in the country. It's really like this, it's really amazing. So we see something and we generalize, and it's already influenced by our emotions. Availability heuristics. Very nice example. There was the example of a lady who said, I voted for Trump. And then she was asked by a journalist, how well are you informed about politics? And she says, I spent on average 5 to 6 hours watching news on TV. And I vote for Trump. Then the journalist asks, which channels do you watch? Fox. So that is availability heuristics. The more frequent you hear a certain statement, the more you believe in the statement. You think that people get bored? No, it's the opposite. So that is social psychology. Then the most important factor is confirmation bias. Individuals prefer facts that fit their emotional judgments. I think we are not at all immune. Also as researchers. We often think that the facts are in a particular way, because then our own opinion on how things should be or are reconfirmed. And if we hear something like this, we think that's good information, but maybe it's wrong information. We prefer studies, empirical studies, that actually produce a result that confirms our bias, but we rarely check how the studies are done. And that is a mechanism which may also explain how post-truth politics works and how we can identify it. Normative judgments define the selection of facts. And that's exactly the opposite how the democratic process should go. We should first identify the facts and then make a normative judgment on how to solve the problem based on those facts. To give you an example, the first way, making a normative judgment for determining the selection of facts, climate change is a hoax spread by the Chinese government to harm American economy. It's a factual statement, right? But it is a decision to believe in this. Or the statement, the German Reich still exists. That's fake legal news. It doesn't exist anymore legally. Yeah, but you simply take it as granted. And you can't do anything against it because it's based on a normative judgment a person has made. While the true question should be, how do we solve the problem of climate change? And since we have so many people who nowadays are engaged in post-truth politics, also the newspapers and TV channels who would want to discuss the solutions of real problems constantly report on the kind of fake news that are spread by post-truth politicians. We are caught up in that trap. The whole media system gets caught up in that trap. What we nevertheless learn from Facebook is maybe it works like a seismograph of modern society. We know much better how people think. I was very surprised. I would not have believed that in Germany we would ever have a right-wing movement that enters our parliament. But now we have it. Now, according to opinion polls, 15%, getting close to the Social Democrats. They are now at 17%, according to opinion polls. Conclusion on this toxic equation. I don't see a conflict between rational political preference of individual users and the efficiency paradigm. So everybody is in favor of the politics that they like most. The problem of neoclassical economics, however, is that the sum of individual welfare or the sum of individual preferences does not equal total welfare. There is a problem here. There is a failure of market to take macro market effects into account, like in the Brexit vote. The UK will do less well after Brexit from an economic perspective, from a macroeconomic perspective. And there is a failure to take the negative impact into account of individual decisions on the political process. And this is a case for intervention or for regulation. But the question is how to do it. And there are many problems with this. Media regulators have started several years ago to discuss this. I mentioned this. I closely looked at the debate in Germany in particular, because there we always had intensive debates on media regulation. And the assumption was now we don't have any need of media regulation because we have a large diversity of opinion on the internet. All opinions are available, but the problem is the selection process. But how do we categorize Facebook? It's not a news producer. It's not like a newspaper that makes an editorial decision on which news are spread or not. The decision is made in a very, very general term based on the algorithm. But Facebook is not looking at the individual news. There was a big scandal in the United States, actually, because some Facebook staff members suddenly realized what was going on, and they thought about, quite loudly, somehow it became public, that they could manipulate the algorithm in order to act against Trump. And even the Democratic Party then said that's no go. You should be neutral. But even if you're neutral, you're not completely neutral. You get another effect which is very, very different. So there's no editorial decision, but the question is, should Facebook be responsible for what kind of news are spread? Should there be editorial responsibility, or should it be a principle of non-discrimination that is applied? And this is mostly, I put it that way, is Facebook a gatekeeper or more like a digital kiosk? Should we think of Facebook like a TV channel or like a newspaper with editorial decisions? Or is Facebook more like a seller of newspapers, and the newspaper seller should have all different newspapers, whatever kind of political orientation it has? I think both perspectives miss the point, because it's simply something else. It's a sui generis phenomenon, which we have problems to categorize. I mentioned that Germany has become very active regarding Facebook, and there were two motions. One is the adoption of a new law, which I translated the title, Act on Law Enforcement in the Network Economy. The German Justice Minister was very concerned about hate speech, which came up enormously during the influx of refugees we had. So right-wing groups immediately started to come up partially with stories, fake stories about politicians, and also hate speech, enormous hate speech against politicians who express themselves in favor of immigrants and refugees. And that created an incredible atmosphere within Germany, and the Social Democratic Justice Minister got together with the representatives of the social platforms, including Facebook, and they entered into a voluntary commitment to reduce and act against such hate speech by reacting to complaints. So whenever a complaint comes in, Facebook should try to decide whether this is legal or not under criminal law in Germany, and then delete this very quickly. Half a year later, the German government made an assessment, and things even got worse. Particularly with differences, YouTube got much better, Facebook was more or less the same, and Twitter was a catastrophe. Mostly, and the argument was, Twitter is economically is not doing very well. So they had to rely very much on this particular economic rationale, but they did not want to get away from it. And then the Justice Minister said we need to do something, and brought in an act, a draft or a bill in Parliament, which then created a lot of criticism, including mine. What this act basically foresees is an obligation of the providers of social platforms to act quickly on complaints concerning hate speech, which is criminal, but it is for Facebook to decide. There is no decision by any court, and it's for Facebook, and Facebook or social platforms are under an obligation to delete such hate speech within 24 hours if it's an obvious case, and within 7 days if it's a non-obvious case. And there is a fine, a potential fine of up to 50 million euros if this is a more, I would say, not a single case, but it's a constant attitude that such a platform would show. The problem here is that the person that actually has posted something has no possibility of judicial recourse. Maybe you get informed, but you don't have a claim. So basically, Facebook might become the censor of everybody. And personally, I also was invited to a meeting at the European Parliament on the initiative of a Polish MP on fake news in Poland. And there you have exactly the opposite problem, because a populist government is in power, who accuses the press of spreading fake news about the government. So it's exactly the opposite. And also from Trump you hear, fake news is what you read in New York Times, right? So Facebook is always what the others spread. Yeah? So there is a large potential of abuse. It very much depends on what country applies such a law. But it's very clear, to my opinion, that this also violates constitutional principles of free speech. So it's very critically discussed, It was adopted just before the elections. It was a very political item for the Justice Minister. And the law now entered into force on the 1st of January 2018, and it immediately showed that it is not working, because on the very first day you had an incredible statement by a representative, an MP in the European Parliament of the German right-wing party, who made an incredible statement. A year before, on New Year's Eve, there was a big problem in Cologne, because for the big party for New Year's Eve, there is a big square in front of the cathedral, and there were groups of illegal immigrants from Northern Africa who over the internet joined to actually go to that square and to harass German women. And that actually happened, and the police was not able to act against this, and that created a loud outcry of right-wing groups, you can imagine. And then, for the last New Year's Eve, the police in North Rhine-Westphalia posted a message to Arab men in Arabic, telling them, please behave well, please respect the rights of German women. And this caused the statement of this MP I mentioned. It's incredible, they are even using Arabic for expressing New Year's wishes to Arab men who are all Muslims and will violate German women. And immediately, many people went to the police accusing this politician of violating German criminal law. If you have this on the internet, is this legal or not? Immediately, there were law professors of criminal law who are certainly not right-wing, and they argued it's covered by free speech. It's very hard to decide whether something like this is legal or not. The argument is there was a reason for expressing her opinion, because there was a real event a year ago, and there was a link between her statement and a factual event, and it's her right to express her opinion, even if you don't like it. That's free speech, and I think it's correct. We have to live with it. Right? By now you certainly understand I'm not a right-winger, after the story with the Reichsbürger, but this is a democratic society, and Germany is a democratic society where also judicial recourse should be guaranteed. Next question. Can we use competition law? Interesting question. We agreed that I should say a few words on competition law. There are two cases who might be quite interesting. First case, Bundeskartellamt against Facebook. That's the second version. The Bundeskartellamt has started investigations against Facebook for degradation of personal data protection rules. Can this be an abuse of market dominance? What do you think? The German agency, competition agency, that's Bundeskartellamt, actually argues yes. We already have by now we have the statement of objections, and we also know about the reasoning in the statement of objections based on a pretty long press release. I will tell you more about it. The argument is, according to German competition law, there is a rule according to which exploitative terms of contract can be considered an abuse of market dominance. And if the contract terms of Facebook are not in line with the rules on personal data protection, according to the competition agency, this can be an abuse. And also to holdings of not necessarily on personal data protection, but there are holdings of German courts, according to which if you agree on illegal contract terms, that this can also be an abuse of market dominance. Another case which I found very important, and this is one of the cases we got aware in the course of our study for WIPO, is an Indian case. And that's the Kansan News case. I don't know whether somebody of you knows about the case. I found this case very interesting. It's something that happened in Punjab. And Kansan News is a news channel which is only distributed through cable networks. The cable and the Kansan News was very much in opposition to the local government in Punjab at that time. And they reported about conflicts within the governing party. When an uncle of the prime minister basically resigned because he had a dispute with his nephew, and so on and so on. And then, when the Cancer News wanted to report on it, suddenly the cable TV provider would change the channel. Whenever a story concerning the governing party showed up, you wouldn't have any images or you wouldn't have any sound. So there was a rather clear case of political obstruction on the side of the cable network provider, which seemed to be very close to the local government. That was the story. Cancer News then went to New Delhi and complained to the commission, and the commission intervened and argued that this is an abuse of market dominance, or more concretely, they applied Section 4 to C of the Competition Act, which has a rule on denial of market access. Or you could also argue that's a case of exclusion. If you look at the reasoning, you don't find any indication that the two companies are competitors in the same market. So I didn't find any indication that the cable provider would also run a news channel. So it was not a theory of excluding a competitor. It was probably more a case on pleasing the local government by acting against the news channel and getting privileges maybe from the local government. And the question here is, can this be justified as a matter of competition law, right? In my article, which I cited here, I rely on copyright principles for explaining this, because that was an earlier publication where I explained that there is a dynamic dimension to copyright. I mentioned this also during our workshop, that copyright actually is designed to create diversity of content. But when it comes to news, it's also about diversity of opinion. So you can apply the same kind of economics based, and copyright is the IP of the news industry. It's the carrier of the news industry. You can apply the same kind of economics also to this. So if you want to have a democratic society with diversity of political opinions, then something like this is harmful. True, I would call it dynamic competition, right? And the question is, how do we analyze this? And the participants of the workshop already know this. And I think now you may see how it works. If you put Facebook in the middle, new business model, it competes for attention by the users. That's the attention market. I think it's also innovation. The innovation is basically providing a completely new product to consumers for which they don't have to pay. If you look at the general definition, for example, in the OSIUM manual of OECD, it's very clear that new marketing practices for services, also the pricing structure, can be considered an innovation. So Facebook is certainly an innovation. All fine, and it works. But we lose something out of sight. Consumer interests, data protection. Yeah? This is where I would place the Bundeskartellamt action against Facebook. Right? And the question is, can we apply competition law? What's the interaction with competition? Is this also a competition law case? My argument would be, it's very important that we don't only rely on the perspective of data protection. We need to identify harm to competition, because otherwise it's not the appropriate law to be applied. Yeah? And that is also what the Bundeskartellamt actually is doing. The Bundeskartellamt is first identifying market dominance, and then it's not simply arguing that there is a violation of the data protection rules. It also argues, based on the indirect network effects, if Facebook as a dominant firm does not respect data protection rules, it gets an advantage over other social platforms, and then strengthens its own market power. So it's illegal strengthening of already existing market dominance. And this makes the case an arguable case on a violation of competition law. So it's not, we should not limit the analysis purely to an infringement of data protection rules. But as I showed you, if we look at consumer interests, our case escapes. Because consumers, to my opinion, act rationally. We have to look at public interest. And the question here is this also a competition case like in Bundeskartellamt against Facebook? That's the question that I would like to look at now. Time is running, but I think it's important how I see the case. Dominance, the first problem. I think it would be wrong to only regulate Facebook. Regulation should not depend on dominance. Why? We have the same mechanism irrespective of which company it is, which social platform it is. You will have exactly the same business model independent of market dominance. Market dominance doesn't play a role, right? So competition in the first place would not be effective enough. It wouldn't cover all cases that we need to regulate. Regulation should be independent of market dominance. So that is a first point where I say competition or maybe not. Second point, do we have harm to competition? There are two possibilities. Like in the Facebook case of the competition agency, maybe strengthening of dominance. That's actually also what Rosenstein is arguing. Rosenstein argues Facebook has to change its practice overall. It has to review the whole business model. The like button is the problem. But Facebook is not doing this, right? So maybe if others don't practice this, or other social platforms take measures against this mechanism and Facebook doesn't, maybe then this also increases market dominance, right? This argument could be made. Also, the economics of copyright, as I explained before, might provide an argument. But there is a problem. And the problem is that we don't have a threshold for identifying what is appropriate behavior and what is not appropriate behavior. That is the problem of freedom of speech. We have to make a decision. We haven't discussed what are fake news. That's enormously difficult. There are many, many variations of fake news. I don't have time for this, but that's enormously difficult. So we don't have any threshold. In the Facebook case of the Bundeskartellamt, it's very easy. You've got a law. Data protection rules exist. And that is actually what the agency takes as a benchmark. So competition law doesn't really work. So in theory, we could actually use it, but it's not the appropriate instrument. So we have to think about other things, and the only thing we can think about is the algorithm. It probably goes too far to prohibit the whole business model, because Facebook also has positive aspects. And the algorithm also presents problems, because we don't know the algorithm. And even Facebook maybe doesn't know it in times of artificial intelligence. Only 3 years ago, the German media regulator argued maybe we should have a rule that obliges Facebook to inform the user about the criteria that are applied. At a time when Facebook already used artificial intelligence. The two arguments against it: Facebook doesn't know the criteria, and second, why informing the consumer? The consumer is not the problem. Or the consumer is not the solution, the consumer is the problem. Even if you know about the criteria, you would behave exactly the same way. So it doesn't solve the problem, because it's the like button, right? It's always people who communicate. There is a new development. Facebook in January announced that it will change its algorithm, although it's artificial intelligence. It said that affinity will become more important. So they now want to prioritize, make the social platform more a social platform. And there was a second element. We will offer the news providers a special service. You are now allowed to get additional space for advertising, but you have to pay for it. Even worse, because before, if you don't have this strong focus on affinity, you maybe get more provision of news that go through an editorial process and a checking of whether it's true or not. Well, if you maintain or put more focus on affinity, it will be a focus on the personal opinion of individuals, which are even more biased, and you don't get any checking or examination of the veracity of the information that is spread through individuals. So it's much more the prosumer than the consumer, that will actually now. So it's very much counterproductive. And there was a lot of criticism, at least in Germany it was a big issue when this announcement was made, with a lot of criticism. What we could do is that we could oblige Facebook to flag news that are highly likely to be false or to be conspiracy theories. And then if you get a red flag, it's for you to be cautious, right? That's one way. And maybe we should have an agency, but it has to be an independent one, to generally supervise what Facebook is doing. Conclusion, post-truth. I think that's also very important. Post-truth and fake news is not a new phenomenon. It has always existed. We had enough fascist movements in Europe, but that we have right-wing and populist movements going in that direction is quite a new development, and this may be linked to this mechanism. Low-quality journalism may also be made responsible in the US. I mentioned Fox News, and also for Brexit. If you look in the UK, maybe it's not BBC. We shouldn't blame BBC, but the newspapers. So there's a problem in this regard. Also, education is a problem. So there is a case for regulation, but there are technical and constitutional limitations what we can do. That is a problem. So at the very end, we are a little bit hopeless, but I think we should also practice civil resistance. I think, and that is also a message maybe as a citizen to you, as a world citizen, kind of a world citizen, it is possible to distinguish better between economic and social communication on the internet and political communication. We know when we get political communication on Facebook, and we should be critical. Inform yourself through media that goes through an editorial process. That's one principle that we should apply. Awareness of the role of producer of political news. We are all producer of political news when we exchange views on the internet. And we might all be biased. Take into account your own bias. Assess political speech. I think that's the number one rule. Assess political speech in the light of constitutional values. And be critical on the presentation on untested facts. What I mean by constitutional values, I'll give you an example. The former president or leader of the right-wing party in Germany, in the debate on immigration with the refugees, she said that it is part of the German law that German police forces or border police forces can shoot against illegal immigrants. It is part of German law. This is legal fake news. The trade union of police people immediately spoke up and said, no, that's not part of the law. And the horrible part of that statement is this lady comes from East Germany, and East Germany has had a policy of shooting against illegal emigration of their own citizens. So the question is, what are the values of those people? By the way, this lady, who is now a member of our parliament, left the party because the party moved too much to the right. That is where we are in Germany. At the last resort, but I'm not calling upon you to boycott Facebook, but you know about the attitude of Justin Rosenstein, and it's your decision how you behave. And finally, and this explains now the title of my talk, I haven't talked too much about shame. Social platforms tell us that we can form new communities of friends. If you live, I grew up in a small Bavarian village, and social control worked through shaming, and people had a natural sense of shame, and that got completely lost. And it's also part of this particular mechanism. Politicians nowadays can lie like hell, and they don't feel ashamed. Justin Rosenstein, there are wonderful interviews. He was once asked whether he feels ashamed of the like button. And this was actually the inspiration for the title of my talk. And his answer was, guess no. He said, I would act and change the business model. And if Facebook doesn't change the business model, we should act against those who actually practice that business model, because we are all consumers in this regard. And we should also act against those, which is also obvious, who very well understand that mechanism and practice exactly that politics in line of the learnings of social psychology. Thank you very much.